Dirk, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction, and thank you also to the Worldwide Wednesday team for inviting me, and solidarity with the in Limbo group and all the great work they do. I shall take a more historical approach to the question of where is global Britain, not least as I'm writing a book about it, as Dirk says. The Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office Policy Forum Wilton Park is the subject, and is recognized by the German ambassador to the UK. Wilton Park was very much a cradle of German democracy, having been a re-education camp for German officers after World War II. In time, the purely German orientation of Wilton Park became outdated and posed questions about its continuation. The founder of Wilton Park, Heinz Kerpler, persuaded the government to turn Wilton Park into a fully international institution, using his methods to discuss without reservation the most awkward and intractable world problems. My proposition to you today is that the UK cannot advance in the world if it retreats from Europe. The UK is more influential, prosperous, and secure if we forge the closest possible relations with the EU. With soft power assets like Wilton Park, I believe we can achieve that again. First of all, what do we mean by global Britain? A preamble to the 2018 Foreign Office collection of documents says global Britain is about reinvesting in our relationships, championing the rules-based international order, and demonstrating that the UK is open, outward-looking, and confident on the world stage. Well, 5 years on, we know much of that is not the reality, particularly as we have divested ourselves of one of our two major relationships. As US Secretary of State Dean Acheson famously observed in 1962, Great Britain lost an empire but has not yet found a global role. I would argue that the UK found a role a decade later, decided it hadn't won for 47 years, and is now trying to find one again. So let's look at some of Wilton Park's more recent discussions to see where we are today and where we might go. A 1996 Wilton Park conference in Zurich commemorated the 50th anniversary of Sir Winston Churchill's visionary speech, in which he exclaimed, "Let Europe arise." At it, Foreign Secretary Malcolm Rifkind acknowledged, "Europe owes its security and prosperity, most of all to the Atlantic Alliance and to the European Union. Without the EU or something like it, Europe would be less prosperous and less secure." Wilton Park's conferences showed the UK as a member state championing pan-European policy decision-making in the single market, competitiveness, and enlargement. It adopted largely intergovernmental approaches in common foreign and security policy and justice and home affairs. More controversially, it led calls for reform of the EU budget and common agricultural policy. But it ruled out participation in economic and monetary union, EMU, and the social community. In spite of the UK's variable geometry approach, Rifkind in Zurich reaffirmed the UK's commitment to EU membership, which was not incompatible with its global ambitions. Britain is committed to Europe. Its future is our future. He quoted Lord Sainsbury, a great Victorian Prime Minister, who said, "We are part of the community of Europe and we will do our duty by it." But then Rifkind said, "We will not turn our back on it. We cannot seek to limit it to a mere free trade area. It is too important to stability and peace on the continent. We have too many shared interests with Europe on foreign policy, justice, and home affairs. The EU is central to our prosperity, not only the single market, but also for our capacity to shape the global trading system in which commerce and prosperity can flourish. It would be odd in the extreme," he argued, "for Britain or any other member state to elect to walk the plank off the other side." But we did. The UK's Maastricht opt-outs and frequent championing of intergovernmentalism contributed to the increasing perception that the UK was a bad European. Some argued not joining EMU may have been seen as a powerful vote of non-confidence in our partners, which would increase Britain's political marginalisation in Europe. Labour's overwhelming victory in the 1997 general election raised hopes for greater engagement with the EU. However, Labour governments shied away from public debate, and referendums on EMU, the Amsterdam Treaty, and the Constitutional Treaty were never called. Labour's timidity on EMU in particular was regarded a missed opportunity, and the vacuum was taken up by Eurosceptics, as we know. The UK, as I mentioned, became increasingly regarded by member states as an unreliable partner whose heart was not in Europe. Before the referendum, the US, Commonwealth countries, and the PRC thought leaving the EU was unwise and would make the UK less attractive. The Global Britain strategy, whose brand now currently appears to being quietly dropped, is regarded by our European partners as a pivot away from Europe. Nevertheless, Brexiters considered the Commonwealth a neglected opportunity, if not alternative, to the EU. However, the Commonwealth lacks institutional structures and hence power and coherence. It has no Security Council, a small secretariat, and no enforcement authority. As an economic entity, it cannot be an alternative trading partner for the UK, as it is neither a customs union nor single market, and its share of UK trade is a quarter than that we had with the EU. Studies show trade loss with the EU far outweighs any gains from the minuscule, often rollover Brexit trade deals with far-flung parts of the world. The UK's global influence and scope for cooperation is indeed diminished by our departure. The UK's decision to leave has contributed to widespread perception of declining UK military and diplomatic capacity and a reluctance to engage on key foreign policy issues. However, as other speakers may indicate, our support for Ukraine appears a notable exception. The government has maintained there will continue to be strong economic and geopolitical imperatives for close cooperation with the EU. Foreign policy cooperation, for example, will likely continue to be strong. Even if the UK collaborates less with the EU, there are many other multilateral forums in which we can cooperate. For example, Council of Europe, UN, NATO, G7, and G20. The UK and EU 27 are likely to pursue common positions on issues such as countering terrorism, climate change, migration, energy security, nuclear proliferation, and sanctions. The post-Brexit emphasis on bilateral relations with EU countries is proving more time-consuming and harder outside EU frameworks. If issues are partner priorities, areas formerly under EU competence may now be more contentious and are subject to more negotiation. Since the referendum, EU member states have at times had to refer the UK to EU institutions rather than trying to bypass them. UK initiatives should not threaten the unity of the EU 27 or supplant EU's institutional architecture. Opportunities for building or strengthening relations with EU countries outside EU competence can include sector-specific cooperation in innovation, research, and so on. But as I mentioned, these cooperation here is more difficult as we remain outside EU programs. Germany is, of course, one of our most important EU partners. In the wake of fractured relations after Brexit, both countries have articulated different ideas about AUKUS and the UN, for example. However, the conclusion of the Windsor Framework on Northern Ireland does provide some optimism for a pragmatic reset of relations. So lastly, Global Britain was in part based on a fallacy that we'd regained sovereignty, which in fact we'd never lost. The UK is unlikely to play a greater role in the world after having retreated from Europe. The US, for example, can no longer regard a UK outside the EU as a bridge to Brussels. As the absence of a US trade deal painfully illustrates, the world will not suddenly embrace us just because we've left the EU. I am, in conclusion, however, sanguine that the UK soft power assets like Wilton Park mean we shall be better able to progress closer relations with the EU and its member states when we have a government which is willing to advocate and progress our true national interest. Thank you, Dirk.